You're listening to Podcasts with Park Rangers, a show where we bring to you stories of the national parks and historic sites from those who know them best, park rangers. Get to know each park ranger for their love of the parks as we discuss history, science, and the beauty of nature from a unique perspective. I'm your host, Lucas VK. Today we interview Shannon Marchuk, the lead Needles District Interpreter at Canyonlands National Park.
I got out of college and I took a summer job in a national park working in a hotel. And that was when I discovered, whoa, I like this. And it was like, so it was a lot of fun to discover me. And I've regularly found that in national parks.
Stay tuned. We'll talk about the job of interpretive park rangers, cowboys in the desert, and what life is like as a ranger living in the Canyonlands. If you're a subscriber and love the podcast so far, we're hoping to keep this show on the road with your support. Supporters receive additional questions from each interview, bonus mini-episodes, invites to hike with us, and more. If you want to become a patron and receive bonus content, visit our Patreon page via the show notes, or visit podcastswithparkrangers.com for more information. One of the most iconic landscapes in the national park system can be found amongst the Red Rock Canyons of Utah. Layers of red, orange, and brown sandstone tower high above the confluence of the Green and Colorado rivers. Today, the Canyonlands are an outdoors paradise for recreation, but for 100 years, cowboys called this land home. In the late 1880s, ranchers brought cattle to the Canyonlands to graze in the winter. The Red Rocks seemed inhospitable for such a trade, but cowboys successfully navigated narrow trails to find water and meager plots of grass. One rancher described the lifestyle as a tough go for short dough, but it was a place they could call their own. Cliffs and boulders posed constant threats to cattle herds. Paths to grassy pastures became blocked by boulders, and these had to be destroyed with dynamite so a cattle herd could be coaxed over the rocky remains. Cowboys would spend weeks at a time in the canyons, living off of canned food and seeking shelter under rocky outcroppings to brave the below-freezing temperatures. To stave off boredom, cowboys roped deer while protecting their herd. Some herds neared 10,000 head of cattle. The cowboy lifestyle, romanticized by Westerns, continued until the mid-70s, when the land changed ownership to the national park system. Cattle still graze outside of the Canyonlands park borders today. As a visitor, you can still see remnants of a cowboy camp in the Needles District of Canyonlands National Park. To learn more about the Canyonlands of today, we sat down with Ranger Shannon Marchuk, lead interpretive park ranger of the Needles District in the park.
Welcome to Canyonlands National Park, and specifically welcome to the Needles. So my name is Shannon Marchuk, and I am the Needles District Interpreter in Canyonlands National Park.
Ranger Shannon has worked in national parks since 1988, when she worked in the hotel industry of Yellowstone. But a desire to become more involved in the parks led her to transition to a park ranger position in 2000.
So it's a funny thing that sometimes your instincts are what drive you, even though you wouldn't have been able to find the words then. So looking back, I would tell you it was because in my previous positions where I was working in hotels in national parks, I was only serving part of what the National Park Service does or what national parks should do. We as an agency have a mission, and simplified, that would be to protect these places and the things that make them special while still allowing people to come in and enjoy them. So there's this really beautiful tension that's formed there, right? Because it's like, okay, if you want people to enjoy them, maybe you have to create more roads or more hotels, but then there's maybe that little bit less to enjoy. So there's this lovely tension that exists here. When I was working for hotels, I was serving only a portion of that. I was helping people enjoy the place, but I perhaps was not quite so much serving the portion about protecting the place. And working in national parks, I had very much grown to love them. So I wanted to serve that side of it.
Initially, Ranger Shannon took a temporary park ranger position at Yellowstone to see if the job suited her. For her, there was one moment where everything just clicked.
Every ranger has that story about that moment when they realized this is what I want to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I had given a short geology talk. I was a brand new ranger, so it was not exactly cleverly named. It was called Geology Rocks. And it was in Yellowstone, and we used to make announcements over a PA system. I made my little announcement, went out, had my group of about 50 people, finished it off, answering questions. Rangers consider it to be good when folks stay to ask questions. We've inspired interest and more questions, right? So I was pretty pleased with that. I'm getting down to my last two people, and it's an older gentleman and a young man I perceive to be his grandson, probably 8 years old. So I'm walking over to talk to them, and I approach, and the little boy looks at me right in the eye with this scowl on his face, and he's like, "We heard the announcement, and he made me come." And he glares at his grandfather, and I'm like, inside, I'm sitting there going, "It's all right. He's just a little boy. You can take it." And then he turns back to me, and his face is just glowing, and he's like, "And you were right. These things really do rock." And I was like, "Oh yeah,
Nice.
This is what I want to do for the rest of my life." So yeah, that was the moment when it wasn't just I was trying something new anymore with my life. It was like, this is where I want to stay.
Right.
Yeah.
Stay and find that beautiful tension, as you put it.
That tension,
Yeah, I like that. And it sounds like that boy probably has a future in acting.
He had an extremely expressive face, but many children do. I think that's why so many rangers really like working with them. It's much easier to know how to present and what to present and whether or not you're doing it well when you can, for lack of a better term, feed off your audience. I sound like a vampire now. But you get that emotional energy back.
Yeah,
Children
you can
are
read
much
it.
more open with that than adults are, right? And so that's always what's fun about kids. There's a lot of expression there.
Right.
But yeah, he was good. He had me going for a minute there. I was like, "Oh, you can do it. You can take this."
We've talked to a lot of interpretive rangers so far. I say a lot. This is interview number 6 for us, but the majority has been interpretive rangers. Why is that an important role for the Park Service, and why is it important that the NPS has interpretive rangers?
Well, not that I'm biased or anything, but I would say it's the most important role. Actually, I think all of the roles are very important, but the reason that you have a segment of the Ranger Corps that has become very specialized in what we today call interpretation is because what we have recognized in today's world, we're all becoming a little bit more disconnected with the natural world around us. We're living in more urban environments. We're communicating in much less direct in-person ways. I mean, everyone today is a mass communicator just with the device that they hold in their hand, right? So really how we communicate has changed. And as a part of that, how we connect with the world around us has changed. It's become much more through devices, and yet experiences in a lot of these parks are hard to fully realize over a digital device. We try through things like social media and mass communications to encourage people to recognize that we're here and to take advantage of opportunities to have those personal experiences. But then when you're here, sometimes it's really hard to understand what's special about a place. The National Park Service houses this huge range of opportunities for people. We have a very diverse collection of national parks, and I think that's part of the beauty. Everyone doesn't have to love mountains and trees or red rocks and sand. There's something for everyone in our system. For some people, what we represent is much more their heritage and their history. And they're much more engrossed in an emotional way when they visit one of our more cultural sites. It could be something of more ancient cultures like Mesa Verde or more recent cultures, perhaps from the Civil War, or perhaps even a recent president's home. So there are all these different opportunities out there, but our hope is that people will take the opportunity to expand their horizons. I know I like trees and forests. What's it like to go to this red rock and sand place? But then you go there and this landscape makes no sense at all if what you know is mountains and trees. It doesn't. And landscapes used to be something we as a species were deeply connected to. but we're not anymore. So most of us don't just go to a place and have that innate capacity to understand it through our experiences anymore. We've kind of lost that language. We don't speak it as well as we used to. That's what I always say is the job of the interpreter. Just like a language interpreter, we interpret places or we interpret moments in history to help you find those handles if you don't have that language to interpret it for yourself. Does that make sense?
That makes, yeah. Okay. So it's all about framing things in a certain context.
Or trying to.
Yeah.
You said a certain context. If I'm doing my job really well, I do it in many contexts because I don't know who's in my audience.
Right.
No matter how many questions I ask to try to learn my audience. Again, if we're doing our job well on the big picture and getting a diverse group of people into the room, then I have to find frames for many different people. So my role is always to try to open what I'm saying or how I'm describing things in such a way that lots of different people with lots of different perspectives can still find what is important and what speaks to them.
Right. So everyone gets to find a personal connection.
Hopefully, that's when we think we've done our job well.
Right.
So there's a quote that goes like, in the end, we will conserve only what we love. We will love only what we understand, and we will understand only what we are taught. I think in many ways, the job of the interpreter speaks very much to this whole thing. We're trying to help people understand. These days, we think of that less as teaching than just helping them connect there. But it very much speaks to the reality of the national parks. I happen to work in a natural national park. So part of what I'm trying to help people understand is a natural world that they may no longer be as connected to. So I'm trying to help them understand that, yes, you may have sand in places you never thought you would after a windstorm, but look at this great sunset. And the amazing colors that are here have to do with the geologic timeframes that blow most people's minds. So how do I even make numbers or timeframes like that make sense to people? So I'm trying to help them see that things that happened on Earth literally hundreds of millions of years ago are having this huge impact on what you're doing at this very moment and how you're experiencing that beautiful landscape out there. And those things, for most people, create a wow, and that's special. And as an agency, one of our fundamental beliefs, I guess, is that if we can help people to care for these places in an emotional way, they will help us care for them in a more real way. They're everyone's national parks, right? We don't just make these decisions for us. We're hoping they're going to help us make really great decisions for these places. So we love to get their input, actually.
So we are here at Canyonlands, specifically in the Needles District.
You are.
But Canyonlands as a whole is probably one of the bigger parks that we've had on the show so far. There are some very large ones, but in terms of overall acreage, this one is enormous. So can you describe this park for the listeners and what makes it so beautiful?
But there are a lot of things that make this place very special. Geographically speaking, we sit at a very unique place. We're on the Colorado Plateau, which by many people is almost considered to be its own unique desert-type landscape. And yet flowing right through the heart of this park are two rivers that join into one, the Green and the Colorado, flowing onward as the Colorado River. So primary water sources for this entire region all converge right here. And that in itself is really unique and really cool. And that part of this park is significantly different from any other park. So visitors to this park often think of us in terms of 3 districts. And those districts are defined literally by how the river kind of cuts the park into pieces. There's a wedge up at the top in between the 2 rivers that we call the island and the sky. And then there's what's on the west side of the rivers and what's on the east side of the rivers. That's kind of how the park breaks up. But for rangers, there's 4 districts because that river corridor is so amazingly different. Vegetation right along the rivers is really different. Sounds are amazingly different. Water changes everything, right? You have a lot more wildlife, or at least very evident wildlife. So we have a lot of wildlife here that people may not see, but along the river corridor, it's much more evident. So it's a very different place. So we kind of think of this park as having 4 different and unique districts. You get those amazing colors because of the very unique geologic past and history that you have here. Also, like all of the parks on the Colorado Plateau, the layers are uniquely flat. Most places in the world, as the Earth has gone through its deformation and reformation and moving and everything's changing, everything gets tilted or bent or cracked. And here, for some reason, everything rose in this giant layer cake. So you get this really fabulous opportunity to see evidence of the past and how all of those layers relate to each other just as they were laid down. And that's a pretty cool thing as well. So I would say that there's a lot of things here that make this place super unique. I would also encourage people, when they think about this place, to look at it on the grander scale. Is it going to be the man-made yellow dotted line, which frequently does not even have a fence in places in this region? Or is it going to be more the boundaries of the ecosystem itself? And then how does the park protect those things that so easily move from one side of a boundary line to the other? Those are challenging questions always for us.
So I think you've touched on this next question a little bit, but if you can speak to some of the visitors' perspective, what do you feel draws people to Canyonlands?
For a lot of people, I think it really is seeing something very different from what they're used to. People come from places that are really humid and really green, and coming here is like these blindingly different colors. There's a lot of beauty in the cragginess and the layering of it all. I think the beauty draws them. I think, quite honestly, also the solitude. A lot of people seem to be coming here wanting to get out into a wilder place and to see what that is like. That's an experience that I think it's becoming harder to find. The Needles District is still one of the more wild places that you can go, but the fact of the matter is we have become quite busy in the last decade. So visitors at certain times of year, I think, are not necessarily experiencing something that they feel is quite as wild as they had hoped for. But if you put 10 people together, they would all have a different, on a scale, how wild they would say this place is. Because some people, just walking on a trail and not a sidewalk is a pretty wild experience. And other people want not to see a person for days. And those are very different standards for wildness there.
And of course, you have a lot of backcountry areas within Canyonlands where people can experience that for days.
Yep, it is. The vast majority of Canyonlands National Park is actually proposed wilderness. So the National Park Service requirement is that we manage it as if it had already been designated as wilderness. So you're not going to find sidewalks out in our backcountry. Our trails will not be designated in that way. Managing what we need to back there is done primarily with hand tools. We don't take equipment back there. So there are large tracts that make it easy to get back and have some alone time.
So we've kind of talked about some of the activities that can be done here. Obviously, we're right outside of Moab, which is a popular destination for many types of activities. And there are a lot of different activities here in the park. Hiking, biking, camping, off-roading, rafting. You mentioned the rivers, climbing, horseback riding. This is just to mention a few. I'm sure I'm leaving some out, but I don't want to be here all day listing. So how does the park manage all these activities?
I think there's a lot of challenges inherent in that. As more people come, we find that we have to be a little more hands-on with our management. And by that, I guess what I mean is maybe we have to be a little bit more intentional in how we manage things. So as you find, you have a lot of people going into these backcountry areas. You go back there and you can find trails where you didn't see trails before, and you can see areas that are getting used for campsites. So over time, in much of our backcountry, specific campsites have been designated, which people now have to reserve. That way, we can ensure that the people going back there have a spot to stay where they won't be disrupting other people or disrupted by other folks. But we also don't have everything impacted by visitors. So one of the things that's unique about the landscape and the ecosystem here is how much area we have that's covered with what we currently refer to as a biological soil crust. So this community of organisms that over time develops into such a nice thick layer, you can actually see it with the naked eye. In some places, several inches thick. It's not visually attractive, but it is this amazing stuff because it helps to hold the sand in place, which of course other plants like it when their sand is not blowing away. That's soil that they can use, right? It helps to hold water like a sponge right after it rains. That's a nice thick puffy thing, and it kind of shrinks a little bit as it dries out. So it actually holds some water. So keeping moisture next to the soil, once again, helps other plants. And as all of the little organisms in that community go through their life processes, they actually fix nitrogen. I like to tell kids they poop cool things into the soil that other things like to eat, you know? So you've got all this stuff going on that makes it kind of a nursemaid for other plants growing up. So we've got this wonderfully plant-rich desert here instead of just sand dunes everywhere, which is awesome. But it's super fragile. The thing it dislikes the most, the thing that is most damaging to that community is actually crush damage. So tires rolling over it or footsteps on top of it. And interestingly, you tend to focus on the impacts that are right here, and yet those impacts are not limited to here. Once you have large areas back here that have been crushed damage, the sand is no longer held in place. That means the next time you have a big wind, that sand is moved. Most of our sand gets blown onto, I believe it's the San Juans. And sometimes, because there's so much sand on the snow, they're finding it melts literally months earlier in the spring because so much sand is blown there. So there's this whole impact, again, beyond the boundaries of the park, that whole concept of a boundary, right?
Right. Yeah.
So we are trying to provide both for that really excellent backcountry experience, but we're also trying to provide for the protection of this visually not so exciting resource that turns out to be really important, not just to us, but people all around us and people who take advantage of that watershed on the San Juan River, right? All that stuff flowing out too early changes everything. So it's really important to do things like be a little more hands-on in your management by creating backcountry sites. So what you see, in answer to your question, is changes happening that allow us to manage just a little bit more how people are using things. So there's rules and regulations regarding where you can take horses, where you can take, you said off-roading, but actually within the national park, there is no such thing. What we have is four-wheel driving,
Right.
but it must always be done on roads.
Designated paths.
Yeah, yep, exactly. So, and we actually now have a permit system for that, even for day use of those four-wheel drive roads. Right now, that's mostly about us gathering information. Turns out electronic counters aren't super excited about being out in the desert, in the sand, in that hot sun all the time, and we weren't getting great numbers from the tracking devices we had. So having these permits is helping us learn a lot more about our backcountry use, but there are actually limitations on them to also keep the numbers from going higher than we currently understand them to be in terms of number of people going out to have a four-wheel drive experience, because those too can be pretty wild experiences if we manage them in a certain way. Right?
Yeah. So specifically targeting this section, which we're in, the Needles District, why does it have that name?
When people are driving in, once they get close to us, like right at the park boundary, approaching the entrance station, usually they notice on the horizon a bunch of jaggedy peaks, usually in silhouette. This is going to sound kind of crazy, but to people who have seen a possum before, I always think they look like possum teeth. They're not all even and beautiful like human teeth. These are jagged, scary looking teeth. Those are the needles. Those are the needles. I think a lot of our names in this area relate back to when cowboys were here. And it was just a visual. Look at those pointy things, needles up on the horizon.
It's evocative imagery from just words.
It is.
Which, of course, us not being a visual medium, we can appreciate.
Exactly.
So you have these needle formations. You've described them as possum teeth. How are these possum teeth formed?
Well, I mentioned before there's a lot of unique geology here. And it turns out that a lot of what you see on the surface here is related to things that are happening very deep below us. So I mentioned all those layers. Below us, below this region, but not super extensive, it turns out there is a very thick layer of salt. It's called the Paradox Formation, upwards of 1,000 feet in places. And salt is a really unique material, like toothpaste in a tube or cold molasses. It flows and it's thick. And then on top of all that, you have a lot of very brittle layers of sandstone. Other things in between, but you've got these brittle layers with this moving layer underneath. So as things happen and this shifts underneath, you get fractures on top, pop, pop, pop. And it turns out sandstone fractures in a very linear way. We have had movement that has caused that to happen in two directions, and they're almost perpendicular to each other. So instead of just having long parallel lines, like you see in the Arches area, long fins of sandstone, our fins then got broken apart again into little square blocks. And over time, those have eroded down into those needle-like formations you see out there today.
Very cool. Geology does rock,
it
after
does.
all.
Cool stuff going on out there.
shifting slightly to your job here. What unique aspects are there to being a ranger here at Canyonlands, and specifically needles?
It's funny, for your audience, I think one of the most unique aspects would be the fact that I live here. So the Needles, by a lot of people's standards, is a very remote place. We are about an hour and a half from the nearest full service anything. We still do not have cell coverage out here. So your audience will probably get a giggle out of the fact that I do not personally own a device. I have a track phone. That's my most complicated device because for better than 80% of the time, I'm not somewhere where I have cell coverage. So a lot of those types of higher tech devices just don't make a lot of sense for me. So I think those are some things that make my world very unique for your audience. And they're just simply more related to the sheer location. I will also say that one of the wonderful things about where I live related to that is extraordinary night skies. We are an internationally designated dark sky park. We have extraordinary night skies here because we aren't close to any city lights that can help haze that. And because the park, in the process of getting its designation, went to the effort to ensure that all of its light fixtures help to protect from light that goes up and impacts our view of the night sky instead of just down on the ground where we really need it. So I have the benefit each evening of walking outside, and even before it's fully dark, I can see the Milky Way on a good summer night. And few people can even see it now on a good night. It's my understanding they're now saying about 60% of the world population has never seen the Milky Way. And I find that very sad. I also value, I think, some things that other people may not, and they may not even know that they are missing, one of which is silence. I find when I visit my family in more urban settings that sometimes I'm standing in a room and I realize my shoulders are up by my ears and I'm trying to figure out what's stressing me out. And I finally realize it's just all the background noise. I'm not used to hearing that anymore. And there's traffic outside and maybe the television's on for background noise. I have learned to really value being able to hear something as simple as the wind, or to recognize different kinds of bird calls. If you've never heard a canyon wren, that's an extraordinarily beautiful bird call. I love it, and we have them here. So those things are of great value to me. So I value silence as well as a result of where I live and what I do.
Speaking about some of the history of the people here, ancient folks, as Heidi called them, because they're not just ancestral Puebloans, but there are others.
Correct. I think when people come to the Needles, they come with at least some minimal knowledge of what we are in terms of geology. Not that they understand the geology, but that's what they expect to be seeing here. They come here expecting to see rocks and a cool landscape. I think a lot of people do not come here recognizing that this is very much also a cultural landscape. I think that's very much one of the lesser known or hidden secrets of the Needles District, that we are very much a cultural landscape. There's evidence all over the place throughout southeastern Utah, throughout this region, throughout the Four Corners, that people have been utilizing this area for a very long time. They've been coming here to this region and living their lives and benefiting from the natural resources here for literally millennia. Earliest signs of people go back as much as 12,000 years. Here in this part, 10 to 12,000 years, so right at that same time frame. And you see evidence, echoes of peoples extending from that all the way to the present. So people have clearly been here and they have made livings here in very different ways. Those people from 10,000 years ago were probably primarily hunters with some gathering going on, and they may have followed remnants in terms of species of the last ice age into this area, maybe mammoths, right? Followed those right into this area, right down the Colorado River corridor to get into this area. That's cool to me. People would have gradually moved into something where they were doing hunting and gathering, but maybe experimenting a little bit with farming. And then eventually they transitioned to being almost exclusively farming, and then farming with husbandry. The ancestral Puebloans that you mentioned, it's believed that they kind of ranched, if you like, turkeys. They raised turkeys and penned them. And today there is still people raising cattle in this area. So you have domestication of livestock in this area for a couple of hundred years at least. So there's a lot of history here in this park. And even right here in the Needles, we have a short trail, the Cave Spring Trail, that gives you an opportunity to see evidence of all of that if you look closely. There's a cowboy camp there. There's evidence of recent park history there. The park headquarters used to be there for a time.
Really?
Yep, a lot of people don't realize that. There used to be like a little entrance kind of area, a little administrative area there right at that same location. There's rock art from 2 different time periods, probably more ancestral Puebloan, and then something in between, perhaps more in a 300-ish years ago, perhaps Ute or someone related to the Ute.
Yeah. So you are an avid hiker.
I am.
As are we. Hiker, camper, and explorer, I would put it. Is that part of the reason you chose to work here at Canyonlands in a community where outdoor culture is such a big deal?
The answer to your question would be yes, but it's interesting when I first started working in national parks, that was one of the things I learned about myself. I didn't know. I came from Texas, which can be very hot and humid, and given the size of the state, has a limited amount of public land. So I had not had a lot of experience as a hiker until I became an adult. And then I started visiting national parks really as an employee. I got out of college and I took a summer job in a national park working in a hotel. And that was when I discovered, whoa, I like this. And it was like, so it was a lot of fun to discover me. And I've regularly found that in national parks. When I first started working at Carlsbad, I did not realize that I love caving as much as I do. I was thinking about those lit trails and all that. It's like, I can do that. Well, it turns out I love wild caving, but I hadn't really done a lot of it before I learned what I was doing in that park.
Just getting out there and exploring is part of finding your own interest.
Yeah, it turns out you're exploring you too always.
Sure.
And that's part of what we try to encourage in our visitors. Don't just explore the place, explore you.
A great message. So when you think of this park here in Canyonlands, what does the park make you feel? Why is it special to you?
I think for me, it is still the sense of space and aloneness and silence that I can find out there. It can be easy in a noisy, busy world to not deal with yourself, to not know yourself. And I think there's a lot of value for us in taking the time sometimes to do that.
Yeah, that's a great message to carry out there as well. So, broader picture then, we've talked about Canyonlands. What is the importance of the national park system to you? And why do you feel it's important to preserve it?
I feel like we do protect and manage a lot of really extraordinarily, not just beautiful, but important natural and cultural places. I feel like America is a very diverse culture. So Americans are very diverse and very different in their interests, in their histories, in their affiliations. And I feel like our national parks try very hard to represent a broad range of things that are of value. Some of the national parks or natural national parks offer things that are getting harder to find, like solitude, like darkness, like silence. I think those things have tremendous value to our species' health. So I think that's one important aspect of it. But I also think as a culture, we value building some history. So I think maintaining some of our history and reminding ourselves of that and establishing kind of what our cultural history is important. So I think it's good that the national parks, they kind of offer both sides of that. They speak to both our heritage and our need as a species to develop who we are as a community. They speak to that, but they also speak to our need as a species for literal physical health. I think today the parks can very much represent both. And so I think we're really important places, and I'm hoping your audience will agree as they visit us.
The enjoyment of a national park can be multifaceted. You can go on a hike and, while you explore, learn more about the cultural heritage found there. In Canyonlands, the history of the ancestral Puebloans and the cowboys of the Southwest add to the layers of unique stories found in the park, much like the layers of the Red Rock Canyons themselves. A common and surprising theme emerges as you explore. Locations of natural beauty often have a rich cultural heritage, and places documenting our history as a nation have a certain magnificence to their landscape. When you explore these places and find meaning in their layers, you may also learn about the many facets of your own character. On your next national park trip, remember, don't just explore the place, explore you. If you enjoyed what you heard, review us on iTunes or your favorite podcast provider to help us improve the show. And for more interview questions with Ranger Shannon about her experiences at Carlsbad Caverns, the Grand Canyon, and on other unique features at Canyonlands, join our Patreon community. As little as $2 a month gets you access to bonus interview questions. A link is posted in our show notes in the description, or visit podcastswithparkrangers.com. Stay with us through the final minutes for a short preview of our next episode. We like to highlight on our show ways that a typical park visitor can give back to their national parks. The Student Conservation Association, or SCA, is a nonprofit organization building the next generation of conservation leaders. As part of the SCA, students can volunteer at Canyonlands as well as several other of the top most visited national park sites. 70% of SCA alumni go on to careers that actively create a more sustainable environment. In fact, several of the rangers we've interviewed on this show began their careers in the Student Conservation Association. For more information, visit thesca.org. That's thesca.org. Even though we interview park rangers, we are not affiliated with the National Park Service, and any views expressed are not necessarily those of the Park Service. We're just fans of the national parks, like you. Coming up in episode 8 of Podcasts with Park Rangers, we're in Colorado at Florissant Fossil Beds National Monument with lead interpreter Jeff Wolin. And in this interview, Sarah and I both ended up a bit emotional. We'll talk about plant and insect fossils, feuding tour operators, and an empowering story about a single mother and her homestead.